In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use Photoshop brushes in conjunction with the painting with shapes technique that I've discussed before to add some texture to your paintings. So I have two different brushes that I think are good starter brushes to work with when you're exploring digital painting. The first is the soft round pressure opacity brush, which is already built into Photoshop, and it's usually available in the general brush settings, and it's going to be called soft round pressure opacity. And this brush can be used to make very soft, delicate, smooth shapes. That's the first brush. The second brush that I like to use is part of the Chris Wahl oil brush set, and I'll just pull this up. And it's, like its name suggests, it's basically an oil brush, and you can pull lines from it, you can layer it, you can vary it up by generating dots or stipples. It's a very versatile brush that allows you to add texture. So you can imagine using something like this for grass or for small flowers, etc., poppies, that sort of thing. So these are two brushes that I use. The Chris Wahl oil brush set you can find at gumroad.com. He has about 60 brushes. He sells it for 15 bucks. Totally worth its weight in gold. And again, the soft round pressure opacity brush is free with Photoshop. So those are two brushes that I would recommend using. The trick with brushes is to pick brushes that are going to make sense for the texture that you're trying to achieve. And I've got a demo that I want to show you next where we're going to add some texture by way of that oil brush to add some value to what we currently have with shape. So I already have this created using the techniques that I've discussed in my previous videos. I'm going to just duplicate that group and move it over here so we can start from the same basic area, and I'll label this as adding textures. And to use the texture brush, let's go ahead and make a new layer above our base. So this tree trunk is going to be called base. I'll make a new layer above it. And I'll go ahead and command click on the tree base to go ahead and select it. Next, what I'll do is I'll bring up my colors panel. I'm going to sample that medium brown that I've used. And the thing I like about the color panel is that you can select values that are lighter or darker, or more saturated to the right or desaturated towards the left. So it's really nice. So when you're painting with texture, you want to think about where the light is coming from. In this specific example, I'm going to have the light source coming from our left. So all the areas that are on the right are going to be contained with shadow. So let's go ahead and pick a somewhat darker value and use our oil brush. And when I paint, I keep my hands on the left and right bracket keys so I can dynamically resize the brush as I paint. So I'm just going to paint along with the surface contours. I'm going to resize my brush to make it smaller in areas, and I'll make it larger in others, and just gently paint the areas where I think shadows are going to fall. So if my light source is coming from the left, the area on the right is going to be darker. I will now go a little bit darker than what I had before and come back in. And you can see that that gives that painting a little bit more contrast. Again, I want to make the brush a little bit smaller. And the oil brush is nice because it's pressure sensitive. I'm using a Wacom tablet for this, so the harder you bear down, the more of the paint is on the canvas. The lighter you press, the less paint. So I've added some dark values in with the selection still active. Let's go ahead and make a new layer. This layer will also be above the base layer. In fact, I'll label my shadow layer as shadow, and I will name the new layer that I just created as highlight. And what I'll do is I'll pick values that are going to be a little bit lighter. So with the same brush, I'll come back in and I'll paint lighter values. And the idea here is if I zoom in, you can see that I want to blend those values and do it in a way that's going to look organic and natural. And this also gives the object a little bit more texture. And I'll go in with some very light values. When you go from a range of very light to very dark, we say that you have a broad tonal range. That means you're going from very light to very dark. And it's good when you're trying to establish things like contrast. So here you can see that I've got areas that are light on the left and areas that are a little bit darker on the right. Now, those little lines that you see here that are kind of showing up, those are textures that I added via shape. So I can control click or command click on that, and I will come back in with a slightly darker brush and just paint those in so it blends a little bit better. Paint them a little bit darker so you can see it. And so now we have part of the tree which is light and part of the tree which is dark. So that's an example of how you can use brushes in conjunction with the painting with shape technique to give a broader tonal range. It makes the object look less flat and a little bit more rounded. And I'm painting in the direction of the tree bark, right? I'm not painting it horizontally, I'm painting it vertically. So once I've got this in place, let's take a look, and I'll make a new layer above this, and I want to paint some grass in. So I'll start off with the same base value that I'm using for the grass. I'm painting on a layer above everything else because the grass at some point is going to overlap what I currently have. So we can start off by making the brush a little bit smaller and just simply pulling up lines, pulling them away from me, and I'm changing up the angle. And I'm going to make the dark values just a little bit darker so you can actually see the effect. And you can also populate it with some small dots. I typically use that when I'm adding stuff like little daisies or flowers. And there's going to be a little bit of overlap here. Again, this is the way I paint, so it's not a prescriptive way. These are just to give you some ideas on if it's challenging and you're struggling with it, something to consider. So again, you can layer it. Look, when I put this brush back on top, it actually makes the colors a little bit darker. You want to be careful. You don't want to, the danger with using the same brush over and over again, especially at the same size, is that it's going to look like you just used one brush, right? So something that I would recommend is changing the bracket key, finding other similar brushes that you can use. Like this one has several dots. Like if I blow this up, you can see it kind of looks like different size, irregular shaped dots. There's another brush that I think is also fairly good, and it's another Chris Wahl brush. And let's see if I can find it here. It's called Hair, and it has a slightly different configuration. And I'll make this a little bit darker. And you can just, I'm going to put the darker values here on the right-hand side, but you can see it's a little bit different. And I'm not just using the same pattern of stroke, I'm changing it up a little bit. And And some dark values. And I actually want to paint on a layer below the tree trunk so that I can actually get closer to it. So this is on a layer behind the tree. And then now what I can do is I like to come back in and just add some grass in the form of shape. So I'm holding down the Shift key, filling in some values, changing up the colors a little bit. And then, so now I've got some grass in there, and it just kind of breaks up all those clumps. I'll come back in with a slightly pink value, and just maybe add the hint of some flowers. Come back in with some white maybe. Right. And so now from a distance you can see that this has a little bit more variety. So I still need to add like a shadow on, from the tree trunk to the ground. And I can do that. Let's start off by going to the base green layer that I have, and I'll just select that shape, Control J, Control U, make it a little bit darker, and then even with that shadow, just make it a little bit darker than that. So now I've got a cast shadow. So now it looks like that tree is anchored to the ground. And the last thing I want to do is I want to add some atmosphere or some value to this. So my sky is simply just one flat color. Let's fix that. If I command click on that, and now if I switch to my soft round pressure opacity brush and make this value a little bit lighter, like almost near white, you can see that there's a little bit of a gradation that I can paint so that the sky doesn't just look super flat. So now there's a little bit of dimension to the sky. And on the topmost layer above everything, I will make a layer called screen, and I want to paint in some warm values to kind of give this a little bit more atmosphere. So again, with the soft round pressure opacity brush, if I go in with somewhat of a saturated red value, and if I dial this brush down, let's set it to screen. The layer should be screen. And I don't know if you can see it too well here. You can kind of see that it adds a little bit of a reddish value. And you'll probably see that down here. So this is what it looks like before, this is what it looks like after. Just adding a hint of red there. Any kind of saturated value really will give it some warmth. And on the opposite side, what I'll do is I'll make a multiply layer. So I'll just call this multiply. I'll set it to multiply. Again, using the same soft round pressure opacity brush. I'll pick a value that's going to be cooler and desaturated, kind of like a dull blue, and come back in and paint those values back here. And so that really makes it pop. So you can see the before and the after. You don't need a lot of brushes to digitally paint, in my view. You just need to have a few good ones that you understand how they work, and I wouldn't just use multiple brushes without understanding why you're using them. So these are two good brushes to start out with, in my opinion. The soft round pressure opacity brush, which is built into Photoshop, as well as the Chris Wahl oil brush. Those are two really nice ones to start out with. Let me know what you think about this video. Give me some comments and some feedback, and if you can, share this with your friends and neighbors. As always, I want to thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something.